Hello and welcome to the Other Minds podcast. I'm Joseph Bohegian. Other Minds, founded in 1993 in San Francisco by Charles Amerkanian and Jim Newman, is devoted to championing the most original voices in new and experimental music. On Season 3 of the podcast, we're talking with a range of composers, performers, and authors across the field of new music, including the featured composers from the 28th Other Minds Festival, which will take place September 25th to 28th, 2024 at the Brava Theater in San Francisco. You're listening to Instruments of Ice by today's guest, Karen Power. Power is a composer from Cork, Ireland, whose work spans orchestral music, sound installation, music for dance and experimental film, and free improvisation. Since 2012, much of her work has been concerned with the use of field recordings and ambient sounds. Power has a new album with Quiet Music Ensemble being released today on Other Minds Records, We Return to Ground, which surveys her field recording compositions written between 2015 and 2022. Welcome to the podcast, Karen.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
For those who aren't familiar, would you explain what goes into making a field recording and how you use those recordings in your music?
Sure. Field recording is a wonderful practice, actually, that I think what attracts me to it as well is that it's a practice that has developed outside of music. So it's a practice that we know maybe more of through the sciences or through different ecological practices. I like to think of it as the same as photography. So when you go to a place and you take out your camera and you take a shot, or you take a picture of a place, you have a visual representation of that place to take away with you. So field recording for me is the aural equivalent of that. So instead of a camera, I'm using recording equipment, and instead of different lenses, I'm using different kinds of microphones to capture different sounds. So essentially, it's a way of preserving or capturing a snapshot for the ears of an environment.
And so are you using one microphone and moving around? Are you setting up multiple microphones and creating a spatial recording? How does that work?
Sure. So it very much depends on the place that I'm looking to record. So I will say that the last thing that I do is actually press record. A huge part of my practice is about listening and allowing enough time for an environment to guide me. So I'm not trying to kind of land. I'm not trying to be a kind of dominant human here. I'm actually trying to be the opposite of that. So I've spent years trying to find ways of being in a place, but sonically being absent from the place. And this for me is why it takes so long. So I'll often maybe spend like a week, 10 days in an environment that I'm interested in. And the first part of that will be about just trying to see what it takes for me to disappear from that environment. So, a simple example would be when we're walking through a forest and we're, listening to the birds, and we're kind of maybe hear a nice bird or something that attracts us. And the moment you walk over there, and think you're getting close to the bird flies off. And so it's, fight or flight response. So a lot of the times I will try and get to a place at a particular time and then try and listen for how long it takes that place to return to a state when maybe I wasn't there. This is also why I seek places that are less occupied by humans. So my interest in listening and recording to these environments is really about being able to eavesdrop on an environment that is being itself, that's not serving humans, that's not changing or adapting around what we have constructed. Now, obviously, there's no place left on the planet that we haven't touched. We all know this. So it's about degrees, right? So I choose places that are less altered or less obviously altered by us. And then I wait and I try to understand the way that that environment is moving, the layers of activity within the environment, what happens when a plane goes overhead, how long does it take that environment to recover, how much of the environment am I actually hearing, and how much is hidden from me. So how much is going on underground? How is that potentially affecting what's above the ground? So there's a lot of kind of, I suppose, listening techniques that I would employ based on what kind of sounds I'm hearing. But fundamentally, I am interested in letting the environment speak and not trying to put my agenda on the environment.
How do you choose these locations that you're recording in? Do you have a running list of places you want to go? Are you being invited places?
Combination of a lot of different things as well. So I definitely have a running list. I'm happy to say that running list is getting shorter, but I'm also happy to say that running list will be there until the day I die. I mean, the more I listen to these environments, the more remarkable and the more unique you realize every single place is. I mean, these are living spaces, which means that they are changing constantly. What you heard in one place last week, you're not necessarily going to hear the week you go after. So there's a huge amount of chance, of improvisation, of whatever we want to call it. And I'm kind of just playing a little part in that dance and hoping that while I'm there, maybe I get to be part of this unique environment and kind of capture something that implies a portion of its life, because that's all I can do. So, yeah, I mean, I will openly say that I am completely ice obsessed. Actually, the sound of ice is probably what started all of this, all of the going to the remote locations. From the moment that I started recording ice, I realized I needed to get somewhere where, there was much more of it. It was much bigger, because the variety of sound within ice is more diverse, more varied than anything else I've ever heard. And then I think some of it's about wanting to alter my own state of listening and also question. I think increasingly I have that question. Like, why do we believe that we are the most important species and that everything is there for our taking? And so I've been interested in putting myself in situations where I'm not the dominant species. And by that, I simply mean somewhere like the Amazon, where the moment you enter that environment, you've got to know that something else that may want to eat you has probably seen, smelt, and heard you long before you've seen, smelt, or heard it. And so this changes your state of listening. And it changes the way you experience that environment, and it's humbling. And it puts us as humans in a different relationship with any environment. And I think that this is a very positive thing that's worth exploring.
An important part of your practice here also seems to be combining field recordings with human performers. So what are you aiming to achieve in the ways you're combining those two elements?
Sure. This is a part of my practice that's sort of always been there. So prior to field recording, I suppose I would have classified myself as an electroacoustic composer. So I've always been interested in that kind of the man-made instrument versus the sound that is not necessarily controlled by human. And so this has kind of come forward into field recording. So I guess I recognize, or I've learned to recognize, or I've always been attracted to the notion that every single thing we encounter, everything we touch, has positives and negatives. Nothing is perfect. And so a lot of my practice likes to explore the uniqueness of every situation or every sound source in this case. Musical instruments have strengths and they also have weaknesses. And humans have strengths, we also have weaknesses, and environments have strengths and weaknesses. So in putting these two giants together, I like to think about the idea of a musician with all of their knowledge, expertise, skills, rules frameworks, the entire kind of Western art system of what it is that makes something musical. And then you put that next to an environment or an ecosystem or a very specific place within an environment with all its rules, with all its structures, with all its layers, all the same things, but these are not the same things. And so this fascinates me. Why are they not the same things? And it's only through our perception and our interaction with them that they become different things. And I don't necessarily hear them as different things. I never have. So by putting these two forces together, I like the idea of there being this kind of challenge for both parties to kind of negotiate the space and find a commonality, because the field recording will have been removed from its original context. And the musician, in most of these instances, is removed from their original context, because what they're hearing is not necessarily conforming to their definition of what music is. Right? So you kind of have this lovely off-the-surface plateau that you've created. And then what happens after that is very much about negotiation and listening and kind of reshaping the environment that they find themselves in. And I've found that this way of working, not alone does it create a kind of an interesting live dialogue space for the performers, but it also creates this space for listeners. It kind of removes the hierarchy of, okay, we're musicians and now we're going to play at you and you're going to enjoy it. So this is much more, the kind of pieces that I'm interested in creating are much more about, this is a whole environment. Once you stepped into this performance space, in whatever capacity, you now have the choice about the way you want to engage and listen and respond to these different things that we're kind of offering. So it's all part of a big plan. I promise.
And speaking of human performers, you're working with Quiet Music Ensemble on this album. They're playing on all three pieces, and you've been working collaboratively with them for some years now. So could you talk about their importance to the work presented on this album?
Yeah, so Quiet Music Ensemble began in 2008. And actually, I had written a piece for their very first festival. And immediately, I know a number of the musicians and the ethos. Life is all about timing. And we kind of came from very different places, but kind of arrived in the same aesthetical place around the same time. And what's really special is that, we've been working together for a number of years. And of course, as artists, one evolves and one constantly changes and hopes to develop. And somehow the development has kind of happened together. So this album is kind of perfect in that it catalogues not alone my compositional journey, which, is a treat for any artist to be able to do that, but also a sort of collaborative exchange journey that's been allowed to develop through these pieces. And so, I think in some of the program notes, I write that these pieces are uniquely shaped and created alongside Quiet Music Ensemble, because they really are. I would be slow to have handed such open works to an ensemble that I didn't know so well, because there's a lot about it. You get that question a lot when you write pieces that have improvisatory elements within them is, well, how do you know when a performance is bad? We all know, right? But it's not necessarily something that can be translated into a language beyond music or sound, but we know. And this relationship has gone from strength to strength. I've learned from them, and I hope they've learned from me. And we've kind of just found a place that still contains lots and lots of room for further development, which is extraordinary and the way I love to work.
In your work, you deal with the method of communicating direction to the performers with something you call an aural score, which is a concept you first developed in your 2015 piece, Instruments of Ice, which is included on this album. So what is an aural score? How does it work, for example, in this piece, Instruments of Ice?
So I guess to maybe understand the aural score concept, and this is also one of the wonderful things about this album, because the writer that we invited to come and write a piece is, of course, David Toop. I've known David for a very long time, and he's partially responsible for my development of the aural score concept, because he wrote a piece for Quiet Music Ensemble in 2009, and I was very influenced by that piece because, again, as an improviser, writer, he was so open to where in a creative process a score might fit and what is a score if not a method of communication. And if it's a method of communication for music, why does it have to exist on paper? And so obviously, lots of other people as well, I mean, but I remember that moment. I remember thinking, okay, yes, absolutely. He's saying what I've been thinking for years, but here it is. So I spent a year in Berlin in 2015, which allowed me a lot of time to develop this concept. And that was 2 years after I'd come back from the Arctic. So it was my intention to use this material for such an amazing multi-sensory place to really kind of try to translate that, not only in the resulting music, but in the processes that I wanted to use to communicate that place and see what the results would be. So the aural score, it's a bit like a normal tape part, except that not alone is it offering information to the audience, but it's offering information to the musicians as well. So they're tuning in to different elements within the aural score. And Instruments of Ice, as you say, was the first piece to try this. And it worked in combination with a series of photographs that each musician is given. And these are photographs that are of the same thing. They're just taken by me. I'm not a photographer, but they are taken by the person who was making the field recordings. And so they are of the same thing, but with a different focus. So it's a kind of a textural element within the photography. And they were also asked to watch a kind of reflective documentary that I made when I returned from the Arctic. And then they were asked to listen to this aural score and following different guidances to respond to different points in the score. After Instruments of Ice, I worked on developing a further part of that, which was the extension into the aural part. And an aural part works exactly the same as, like, let's say you have a normal orchestral score, like a paper score in front of you. And then each of the players has their own part. So the aural part works exactly like that, except it's for the ear. So it's extracted from the main aural score, but there are more detailed and player-specific elements built into the aural part. And the player listens to it in just one ear, and then the other ear is open to the ensemble. So it also kind of puts them in a very interesting state as they kind of operate from within and without. It can be quite challenging and take quite an amount of time for people to get used to. But that in itself, I think, is interesting, right? Because then it becomes part of the process as well, and not just a kind of an add-on. So, yeah, but mostly with Quiet Music Ensemble, because we've been able to work together, Sonic Pollinators uses an aural part. But in We Return to Ground, I decided not to go down the aural part route because Quiet Music Ensemble are so experienced with listening that actually it felt like it was getting in the way of what was happening.
In a moment, we'll listen to an excerpt of Instruments of Ice, but before we do, could you explain where you made the field recordings for this piece?
Sure. So Instruments of Ice field recordings were made in the Arctic during a residency trip in 2013, which went basically up the side of Svalbard on a sail ship, which took about 2 weeks.
Let's listen to an excerpt of Karen Power's Instruments of Ice, performed by Quiet Music Ensemble. So after Instruments of Ice, what did you learn from this first experience of creating an aural score, and what changed in new iterations of the concept, for example, in the next piece chronologically on the album, Sonic Pollinators?
Yeah, so obviously there were pieces in between and experiments in between. And during these experiments, I had been working a lot with large ensembles. And so I devised different systems whereby we would have these aural parts to help kind of structure an ensemble a little bit more. So Quiet Music Ensemble is a 5-piece ensemble, whereas Ensemble Mosaic or some larger ensemble, you're dealing with a lot more musicians, and it suddenly becomes impractical for them all. They just needed more guidance. They needed more information to feel that they were, I guess, being guided in their listening. So those were experiments, and I've stayed with the concept of the aural part. So most pieces now, unless I know the ensemble very, very well, will go out with an aural score and an aural part, which is the individual, and then usually a graphic representation on paper. Sometimes it's text. Sometimes it's fully notated as well, depending on the ensemble. And as you mentioned in the beginning, I've written orchestral works. So the orchestra, because of that framework, works best within the context of notated music. So why would I ditch that? As you know, composing is 90% negotiation once you get a piece to that stage. And so I feel that part of my job is to listen to the way an ensemble works, and then to kind of tailor the way I work or what I want to communicate to that ensemble as best I can to ensure that they're going to get the best result, and they're not going to have to feel like they're fighting with a piece in order to kind of unravel it. So this is a part of my practice that I take very seriously, and I've spent a lot of time trying to refine, because what I do is not normal, but it's really fun when you find an ensemble that's up for it and willing to take a few chances. Then it can be a real eye-opening experience.
You write in the notes for Sonic Pollinators that the musicians of Quiet Music Ensemble create musical dialogues that seamlessly meander between music, sound, silence, and nature's pollinators. Is there also an attempt here to create a dialogue between humans and non-human beings, whether that's the performers or the listeners?
Absolutely. I would say that's possibly a primary interest. And I would also say that although it probably wasn't there when I first started field recording, because of kind of experiencing place, being in place, recognizing the strengths and the fragility of place, and of course, living in a world that is currently in the state that it's in, it has become a very, very primary part of what I do, is to create that space for real dialogue and real understanding. Because I do think, a friend of mine once said about something completely different, but it somehow fits here. You can't be what you can't see. And so I think in terms of climate and in terms of our relationship with the planet, my ambition is to create that situation, a positive situation, a situation of listening, of learning, of understanding, of empathy within the performance environment that I seek to create, with the hopes that if the audience sees that and experiences that and feels that it translates outward onto them. And, one leaves a concert or whatever you want to call it, an experience like that, slightly altered with a slightly different perspective than you did when you came in. And I think that's got to be, it's one way to maybe change our attitude towards environment. So I would say that at this point, it's become a very important part of what I do.
I was about to ask you who the sonic pollinators in this piece are, but perhaps I should ask first, is it important that the listener knows the sources of these field recordings, of what's being recorded, or is there an element of discovery in listening to the piece where you perhaps think through what you might be hearing?
That's a really good question. And I think, again, although a lot has changed about my language, I think that element actually remains the same. So for me, it's about dancing that line between audible recognition and potential of what that sound could be. So my aim is to offer a kind of a comfort of hearing to audiences. So maybe you know what it is, maybe you have a very personal relationship with bees, maybe you don't, but I'm not interested in anchoring it to this could only be bees. So it's always about kind of pushing and pulling and kind of playing with that sonority or that space. And of course, that's what the musicians are doing. So they're offering a new perspective of hearing already, on a very, very simple level. Once you've heard a piece like Sonic Pollinators, I believe that you won't quite be able to hear bees the same way again, and you won't quite be able to hear a cello the same way again, or a double bass. Everything bleeds, and a lot of the works are built, the structures are built to allow the time for those bleeds to kind of possibly reoccur. So the pieces, to me, are not so much linear. They don't really deal in linear time. They are themselves micro-living environments that transform and that maybe reference the past, maybe reference the future. And so a lot of things that are built into these pieces actually refer to sort of memory of hearing and memory of playing, so like muscle memory, but just for the ear. I certainly wouldn't be interested in people getting caught up with, oh, what is that? But equally, I offer you these works to listen in the way you'd like to listen. If your interest is in trying to recognize whether that's a queen bee or a worker bee, then that's wonderful too.
Great. Well, with that in mind, let's listen to an excerpt of Sonic Pollinators by Karen Power, performed by Quiet Music Ensemble. The most recent piece on the album is We Return to Ground, which you wrote in 2022. The piece features field recordings from the largely unheard life from beneath the surface of a variety of bodies of water. Could you talk about this piece and how it encourages listeners, as you've been mentioning, to approach unfamiliar sounds in our relationship with ecosystems that might be invisible to us?
So again, I suppose a lot of my field recording practice from a very early stage recognize the bias of hearing, right? So our bias, because our hearing caps out it and bottoms out. And so the very idea that we are immediately only registering a portion of the world around us. And what would happen if we open up that question of, does our behavior in a space change based on sounds that are existing in that space, but we can't hear them? Like, are we still altered by those sounds? And so I began to search for inaudible sounds in various capacities. And in a sense, all three pieces exhibit this. But I guess We Return to Ground is a real focus on not alone hidden sounds, but sounds that and creatures that should not exist. I mean, one of the main pools is from a bog that was flooded, deliberately flooded years ago in order to supply electricity to Cork City. Visually, it's very striking, but it's not beautiful, right? Because you've got all these dead trees and it's a bit of a wasteland. But you walk there and there are these ponds that are tiny. They're not very deep at all. They're only I would say about 3 inches deep. They're kind of brown and gooey and you're thinking there's no way that anything is alive down there until you lower the hydrophones in and you realize this tiny, tiny pool is teeming with life. And the reason it has life expands our version of time, right? So it highlights the fact that we are completely clueless when it comes to the larger frame of time. And actually what's keeping these creatures alive are past glacial waters that happen to flow down the mountains through these streams, and this in turn created and sustained this life. So that begs the question, when we're tromping around things and kind of thinking that we're, we'll avoid this squirrel that we see because, we don't want to damage that. But what about the fact that I've just walked through a muddy pond and have possibly destroyed an ecosystem in there? And so, the piece is about, again, changing perspective. It's about bringing us all down to ground and altering what we consider to be life. I was just really inspired by what I heard when I was in this place. I mean, I've heard lots of things underwater, but this was just so tiny and so grotty looking that it was just such a surprise. And so these creatures, by their very nature, like a lot of them are tiny, tiny, they have these beautiful hypnotic patterns that go on and on and on. And they exist in kind of these beautifully moving layers that we are totally outside of. And that, you just have to kind of give yourself into that, which is, again, why I was so keen to work with Quiet Music Ensemble on this piece, because I felt, okay, well, if anybody's going to get the fact that we have no place here, it's going to be them, and you need to leave room for these. And the piece was originally conceived in collaboration with a dancer and a videographer who were also inspired by these field recordings. So it all comes from the field recordings, and then the piece is created around those with different elements.
Let's listen to an excerpt of We Return to Ground by Karen Power, performed by Quiet Music Ensemble. Karen Power's We Return to Ground is available now from Other Minds Records as a double CD and digital download. You can pick up a copy from the Other Minds Bandcamp and web store. We'll be back soon with interviews for the upcoming release of Brian Baumbusch's Polytempo music in August, and with the composers of Other Minds Festival 28. Thank you, Karen, for talking with me today, and thanks everyone for listening.
Thanks.
This has been an episode of the Other Minds podcast, brought to you by Other Minds. Our 28th festival is September 25th to 28th, 2024, at the Brava Theater in San Francisco.